Hello everyone, welcome to the next lesson of the animal behavior course. This is chapter 8.1 where we're going to be discussing cooperation. Alright, so just a quick review from the last lesson before we begin. Remember, in the last lesson we focused on kin selection. This is the idea that helping your relatives can still boost your evolutionary success because relatives share a proportion of your genes. Now, we described direct fitness as the genetic success of your own offspring and indirect fitness as the success gained by helping relatives produce their offspring. And then when we add those two things together, we get what is known as inclusive fitness, which is a broader measure of how your genes spread throughout a population. However, not all helping in nature occurs between family members. In fact, a surprising amount of cooperation occurs between unrelated individuals. We define cooperation as two or more individuals working together in a way that benefits all involved. Now, this raises a fundamental question of evolutionary biology, though. Why would an animal help another that isn't related to it? If you think about it, an unrelated individual shares no proportion of your genes. And so that is going to be the fundamental question that we try to answer today. You might be thinking, wow, that is a broad definition for such a complex behavior. And it is. This definition is intentionally broad because cooperation is actually quite a widespread phenomenon. The complexities and processes that underlie it can vary greatly, but across all life, we see examples of cooperation that are astonishing. Some cooperation is genetically programmed, such as the mutual relationship between plants and rhizobia bacteria, and some of cooperation is learned and develops through more complex cognition or learning mechanisms, such as the coordination seen in orcas and chimpanzees. Cooperation can occur between species, such as the cooperative hunting behavior of moray eels and groupers, or the cleaning mutualisms between cleaner wrasse and reef fish. Juveniles cooperate when they play together, fish cooperate when they school together to prevent predators from eating them, and even slime mold, which can sacrifice many of their own cells to form a non-reproductive stalk that lifts others to safety, also would be cooperating. And so given how widespread cooperation is, it begs the question, what does this tell us about cooperation? Well, it tells us that working together is so fundamental to living organisms, even plants it appears, that it has evolved through countless pathways across the plant and animal kingdom. To make things a bit more manageable today, we're actually going to narrow our focus to cooperative behavior in animals as a way to understand how cooperation could have evolved. These are behaviors that are not genetically programmed like the plant bacteria mutualisms, but they still persist across generations and are shaped by natural selection. A classic and widespread example is social grooming, also known as allo-grooming, where one individual grooms another. This behavior is one of the most obvious and frequently observed forms of cooperation studied by primatologists. At first glance, the function seems straightforward. Grooming removes parasites or debris from a partner's body, allowing them to be cleaner and healthier. But the story is actually much richer. Grooming acts as what researchers sometimes call a social glue that helps hold animal groups together. In primates, for instance, grooming is strongly associated with tension reduction. It lowers stress levels within the group and helps to reinforce social bonds. And this isn't unique to primates. Many other animals engage in social grooming. Birds, for example, engage in a behavior called preening. When new feathers grow, they sometimes are covered in a keratin sheath that needs to be cracked open so that the feathers can be exposed. And so while birds can handle most of the preening themselves, they need a help to sort of reach these hard to reach places like the back of their head and their neck. Thus, the benefits are clear. However, grooming isn't without its costs. It can reduce vigilance against predators or rivals while an animal is focused on its partner. But despite these costs, the behavior persists widely. And so what does this tell us? Well, it shows us that the benefits must outweigh the costs. So we know that cooperation is widespread and that its ubiquity says that it is so fundamental to living organisms that it evolved in many ways. But the question remains, why? Why is it so widespread? Well, I already hinted at the answer to this question in the previous slide, but cooperation evolved because it provides a net benefit to all parties involved. This mutual benefit is what allows cooperation to persist. But how that mutual benefit arises isn't always simple, straightforward, or obvious. Biologists have proposed several different evolutionary pathways through which cooperation can evolve. The first is the one that we've already covered, kin selection, where helping relatives spreads shared genes. But another mechanism is known as byproduct mutualism. This is where cooperation happens, not because individuals are deliberately helping each other, but because their actions just incidentally benefit others while benefiting themselves. In these cases, cooperation is simply the best strategy for everyone involved. The third is reciprocity, where individuals help others with the expectation that the favor will be returned in the future. Essentially, it's cooperation that is built on repeated interactions and trust. And finally, group-selected cooperation, where traits that benefit the group, even if they come at a cost to the individual, can spread because these traits help groups that cooperate outcompete those that do not cooperate. Now, each of these pathways offer a different explanation for how cooperation can evolve and persist, and together they help us to understand why this behavior is so widespread across life. The simplest way that cooperation arises in animals is through byproduct mutualism. This occurs when individuals cooperate, not because they're making a sacrifice for someone else, but because cooperation is simply the best strategy for their own self-interest. The benefits to others are essentially a byproduct. This is considered the simplest pathway because it requires little, if any, understanding that cooperation is even taking place. Simply by having more social partners acting in the same way as you, you can achieve mutually beneficial outcomes. Now, a key feature for this pathway is that payoffs are immediate. There's no need to wait for a partner to return the favor, as in the next pathway, reciprocity. Because of this, byproduct mutualism is much less vulnerable to cheating. If you fail to cooperate in the moment, you often lose the benefit yourself. Take lion hunting as an example. A single lion struggles to bring down a large prey animal like a buffalo, but several lions working together can succeed. Each individual lion gains access to food they could secure that they really couldn't normally secure alone. Now, another case that is classic is the example of schooling fish. By moving together, individuals reduce the risk of being singled out by a predator, and everyone gains safety at once without any sort of delay. Now, mathematical models predict that byproduct mutualism is most likely to evolve in harsh versus mild environments. What constitutes harsh and mild will depend on the system that's being studied, but in Taiwanese Yuhina, harsh environments are characterized as those with excessively high levels of rainfall, which is correlated with lower foraging success and lower hatching success. And so researchers studied these communal nestings and found that significantly more cooperation occurred in these harsh environments than in the mild environments. And so harsh environments have also been found to sort of help cooperative behaviors in other animals like feral dogs when they hunt. And so this really shows that cooperation, and specifically byproduct mutualism, can be sort of context dependent and arise in certain contexts, but maybe not others. All right, the next major pathway proposed to explain the evolution of cooperation is reciprocity. The basic idea is simple. I help you now, and you help me later. Over time, both individuals benefit, even though the act of helping might be costly in the short term. For reciprocity to evolve, certain conditions usually need to be met. Individuals must have repeated interactions with one another. They usually then must be able to recognize and remember their partners. However, it is worth noting that in some situations, reciprocity can emerge simply from stable association patterns or repeated interactions with the same group members based solely on space. So even if you can't tell each other apart, you can still reciprocate. Lastly, individuals need to be able to adjust their behavior and move away from reciprocal partnerships that are not paying them well. If those conditions hold, cooperations can arise even between unrelated individuals. Now, a classic example of reciprocity comes from vampire bats. After a night of unsuccessful foraging, a hungry bat may receive a blood meal from a groupmate that fed successfully. The next night, the roles might be reversed. Today's donor could become tomorrow's recipient. And so over time, this exchange of benefits sort of gives a net benefit to both individuals, especially in a system where starvation risk is really, really high. However, because payouts are not always simultaneous and immediate, reciprocity has a key problem. Namely, it's vulnerable to cheaters. These are individuals who accept help but never really return it. So how do animals solve this problem? Well, many animals have evolved strategies to minimize the risk of cheating, such as remembering past behavior, refusing to cooperate with defectors, or even punishing cheaters. One classic example of this comes from vampire bats. The example that I just gave you, basically the bats will regurgitate blood to their groupmates, but they keep track of who reciprocates. And so individuals that don't return the favor over time are much less likely to receive help in the future. And so essentially the bats will deny the blood donations to past non-donors, discouraging sort of this freeloading or lack of cooperation in the group. Another striking example involves cleaner wrasse, which are a small fish that eat parasites off of these larger client fish. Most of the time, this is a mutually beneficial interaction, but sometimes a cleaner fish might cheat by taking a bite of the client's mucus instead. And the reason they do this is the mucus is more nutritious, but it harms the client because the client needs this for protection. When this happens, the clients will often terminate the interaction immediately and even chase the cleaner fish away. Moreover, other potential clients watch these interactions and then avoid cleaners with a history of cheating. And this kind of punishment and partner choice strongly discourages cheating and keeps this cooperation, this cooperative biological market system stable. Now, reciprocity can take several different forms depending on how the benefits are exchanged. The most straightforward is direct reciprocity. I help you, you help me. This is what we see in vampire bats sharing blood meals, cooperation between the same pair individuals over sort of repeated interactions. But there are other examples. For example, indirect reciprocity is where helping builds a good reputation, and then this leads to others, not necessarily the original recipient, being more likely to help you in the future. This relies on social information and is thought to play a big role in primate and human societies. And lastly, we have generalized reciprocity, which is a simpler form that doesn't really require tracking individuals at all. The idea is I was helped, so I will help somebody in the future. It's about sort of paying cooperation forward, and it can really help stabilize helping behavior even when individual recognition is limited. Now, one way biologists study reciprocity and the evolution of cooperation is through game theory, which is a mathematical framework that models how individuals make strategic decisions when their outcomes depend on the choices of others. A classic example of this is known as the prisoner's dilemma, which is a simple but influential model that captures the fundamental tension of cooperation and defection. In this game, two individuals each have a choice: cooperate or defect. If both cooperate, they both receive a moderately high payoff, and so this is the best outcome for the pair. But if one cooperates while the other defects, the defector will get the highest possible reward, while the cooperator gets the lowest. If they both defect, then they do poorly, but not as poorly as that imbalanced situation. And so the key insight here is that although mutual cooperation produces the best outcome for the group, defection can be tempting because it often yields a better outcome for the individual in the short term. The prisoner's dilemma helps us formalize and explore the sort of conditions under which cooperation can evolve, and how reciprocity can emerge even in situations where selfish choices can sometimes be more profitable. Now, one reason that we talk about game theory and the reason it's so exciting is that it's actually really translatable to real animal behavior. For example, the prisoner's dilemma and other games help us to explore how cooperation, conflict, and reciprocity might evolve under different conditions. However, it's important to be cautious because some criticize that these models don't always measure what they claim to. And so the assumptions of perfect knowledge of payoffs and discrete choices can often simplify the structures and of the messy reality of animal life. And so when we do the prisoner's dilemma with humans, we can often give them verbal instructions, for example, but animals can't get those verbal instructions. And so there is a lot of debate about whether running these sort of prisoner dilemma game theory examples in animals actually shows us what they're wanting to show. The last pathway we'll look at is group-selected cooperation. This framework emphasizes that natural selection can operate at two levels at once, within groups and between groups. At the within group level, selection tends to favor selfishness. Individuals that take more than they give can sometimes outcompete cooperators in the same group. But at the between group level, groups with more cooperation tend to function better, survive longer, and outcompete the groups that don't show cooperation. This sets up a kind of tension. Selfishness can pay off within a group, but cooperation can make the group as a whole more successful. If between group cooperation is strong enough, cooperation can evolve even when it's costly to other individuals. Let's look at the classic example of group-selected cooperation by looking at alarm calls. And this is basically when an individual of the group will alert the rest of the group to a predator. The individual doing the alarm caller obviously pays a cost because they're the most obvious target for the predators, right? They're making a lot of noise. But their sacrifice may benefit the group overall, as other individuals, including alarm callers and non alarm callers, can then evade the predators more easily, which can then allow that group to be more successful than groups that don't have alarm callers. So, for example, if there's a group without alarm callers, maybe the predator can sneak in and eat more and more group members. And so this is sort of an example of how, even though an alarm call is really costly, it works better because it makes the group that has alarm callers more successful than groups that do not. And so let's look at one of the more famous studies on alarm calling in animals. A group of researchers studying vervet monkeys noticed something really curious. The monkeys seem to give different alarm calls for different predators. So here's the question. How could you test whether these calls really mean different things? Take a second and think about that. Pause if you need a little bit more time. So what the researchers did was play recordings of alarm calls to groups of vervet monkeys when there were no predators present. And then they could see whether the monkeys responded differently to the different kinds of calls, even though the danger wasn't really real. So what would you predict? If the calls truly have meaning, how should the monkeys respond? Well, if the call means something then to the other monkeys, then we would expect them to react to specific calls differently, right? And that's exactly what happened. When they heard the leopard call, for example, the monkeys ran up into the trees. When they heard the eagle call, they all looked upwards and then ran into cover. And then when they heard the snake call, they all stood up on two legs and scanned the ground as if they were looking for something on the ground. And so this tells us that monkeys weren't just reacting to the caller's fear, but they were actually discerning the differences in alarm calls and then using those to guide their behavior. The vervet study is actually really, really famous because it showed us that animal communication can be referential. The calls can sort of act like words, kind of like leopard, eagle, or snake. And it's one of the clearest examples of cooperation through communication where one individual's call can help sort of protect the entire group. Now, another example of cooperation, sometimes considered a form of group selected behavior, is the formation of coalitions and alliances. Now, a coalition is when two or more individuals join forces in cooperative action against another individual or group. These are often short term arrangements formed to gain immediate advantages. For example, two subordinate male chimpanzees can team up to briefly challenge a dominant male. Now, when these cooperative relationships become long-term and stable, we will often refer to them as alliances. Alliances often involve reciprocity and trust built over time, and they can be really crucial to long-term reproductive success. Now, one sophisticated example of alliances is seen in bottlenose dolphins. Dolphins mostly will sort of form these coalitions to defend territory, and males will also use them to guard female dolphins. Although females will also form coalitions to protect their calves, for example. Dolphins, however, take it a step further, and they form what researchers call super alliances. And these occur when multiple male coalitions will actually cooperate with one another, forming alliances of alliances. And the purpose of these alliances is to sort of increase all of the males' reproductive success within the group. And sort of this is sort of a remarkable because these super alliances can actually be really, really long lasting and stable, sometimes lasting for years. Another example is in bonobos, which we briefly discussed in the last lecture on sexual systems. And so in bonobos, we see a very different but equally fascinating form of cooperation. We see female-female alliances, and these alliances are crucial for maintaining the remarkable levels of peace and social tolerance that sort of characterize the bonobo society. Females form these strong bonds with one another and often team up to resist or discipline any aggressive males. These alliances help keep male behavior in check and create a more egalitarian social system. Like I said, as I mentioned in our last lecture, these bonds are often reinforced through female-female sociosexual behavior. These same-sex interactions really serve a bonding function rather than a reproductive function to sort of keep the females bonded within a group and strongly, tightly knit. So in bonobos, cooperation among females not only protects the individuals, but also fundamentally shapes the social system of the species, highlighting how alliances can function as a stabilizing force in complex societies. All right. So far, we've been focusing on intraspecific cooperation, which is what happens between individuals of the same species. But cooperation is not limited to that. When it occurs between different species, we call it mutualism or interspecific mutualisms. One classic example of mutualism is between the cleaner wrasse and the lionfish, which I already discussed. But cleaner wrasse will basically feed on the parasites and dead tissue and help sort of clean the bodies of larger fish. The wrasse gain a reliable food source, while the lionfish gain better health and reduced parasite loads. This is a win-win scenario. Both species benefit more from working together than they would alone. What's fascinating, though, is that this relationship requires sort of a high degree of trust. The larger lionfish could easily eat the smaller wrasse, but instead they tolerate them because the benefits outweigh the costs. Now, let's talk about a really interesting example of interspecific mutualism by studying how groupers and moray eels hunt together. This work was actually done by Redwan Bashari, and while he was out swimming on a reef, he noticed something really peculiar. A grouper once approached a moray eel and started shaking its head back and forth. Now, originally he thought these two predators are going to compete for who is going to be the top fish on the reef. But then to his surprise, they actually swam off together side by side. And so then the grouper basically swam over to the reef and sort of did this pointing behavior where he looked down at the reef and then sort of stayed in this position like this. And then that's when the eel all of a sudden decided to go off into the reef and basically push the prey out, and then the grouper was able to eat the food. After studying this a lot in the wild, they found that sometimes the eel would receive the prey and sometimes the grouper would receive the prey. So this is a sort of mutually beneficial opportunity for both animals. But that's a really cool observation. But they wanted to sort of take it a step further. So they actually brought the groupers into the lab to conduct a controlled experiment. And what they did was they put an artificial reef into a tank of the grouper, and then they placed a prey item inside of a column under a rock so that the grouper could not access it. The grouper then had to go to another artificial reef where a paper cutout image of a moray eel was lying in wait. The researchers then measured whether they would recruit like they do in the wild, and sure enough, they did. They would recruit the picture of the moray eel, which would then be pulled over by a string to the tank, to that column, and then the grouper would get a food reward. And so they wanted to take it actually even a step further and understand whether groupers could actually choose between two different cooperators. And so they basically trained the groupers to learn that one of the eels was a good cooperator and one was a bad cooperator. And then they measured which eel the grouper would choose. And they predicted that they would preferentially choose the good cooperator over the bad cooperator. But let's take a look at the results and see what happened. So here are the results on a graph. What does this suggest about the preference for the groupers? Awesome. If you said that it shows the groupers do indeed learn to choose the better cooperators, then you would be correct. We see that they had a larger proportion of selecting the good cooperators over the bad cooperators, suggesting that they were able to learn, much like other animals, which cooperators are good and which ones are maybe less reliable. All right, so that is all the time that I have for this lesson today, but here are some excellent additional video materials on animal cooperation. Feel free to go watch them to learn more. I'm going to leave the links to all of these videos in the description of the video. But let's go ahead and wrap up by seeing the big picture. So cooperation is a widespread phenomenon seen across the tree of life. From microbes to plants to complex social animals, it happens both within species and between species, and while the forms it takes can be very diverse, the unifying feature is that cooperation provides a mutual benefit. We've looked at several pathways that explain how cooperation evolves. We've seen kin selection, reciprocity, byproduct mutualism, and even group selection. And what these all show us is that cooperation persists when the benefits to individuals outweigh the costs. And so I really want you to remember that we see cooperation across so many living organisms. And this suggests that working together is so fundamental to being a living organism that cooperation evolved in so many different ways and persisted throughout time. So I really hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I hope you found it really helpful.